بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to our reading of this great text from our Tariq, Qawa'id al-Tasawwuf, the Principles of Sufism by Sidi Ahmad Zarruq radiyallahu anhu. Picking up where we left off, Principle 70. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين أمين. Sidi Ahmad Zarruq, he says, may Allah Ta'ala be pleased with him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Principle 70, piety, nusuk, it's not really the best translation. A nasik is the worshipper. So a nusuk is literally the pilgrim rites, R-I-T-E-S, rites. We call them the manasik. But nusuk as a plural in general means acts of worship. So a nasik, when you say that somebody is a nasik, means it's like a word that describes somebody who's engrossed in worship, versus the alim who's engrossed in study. But anyway, I mean it is based on piety, but I highlight the translation issue because Sidi Ahmad Zarruq means something specific by that. Anyway, he says the worshipper is practicing as many virtues as possible without regard to anything else. If one desires realization in that practice, he is a devotee, he is an abid. If one desires to carry out what is most prudent, he is a God-fearing man with scruples. Al-wara is to follow the most safest and conservative opinion, versus the one who takes the rukhsa, who takes the dispensation. If he chooses renunciation seeking inner peace, he is an ascetic, a zahid. If he surrenders himself to the divine will, he is a Gnostic, an Arif. If he molds himself on someone who is attached to him, he is a novice, a murid. Both the Qut al-Qulub of Abu Tayyib al-Makki and the Ahya of Abu Hamid al-Ghazali have dealt with this topic. So in the first paragraph, Sidi Ahmad Zarruq is saying, okay, the people that worship, that are focused on worship, which is supposed to be us. I mean, that's what tasawwuf is about. It's about the focus on worship. There are different manifestations of worship. So the one that's doing all of like the salawat, all of the sunnahs, all of the fast days, we call that person an abid. That guy is, and it's a great thing, right? That guy is dedicated, or that sister is dedicated to worship. And if you are always saying, what's the correct position here? What's the most difficult position there? That person is called al-mutawarra, the person that's very cautious, so on and so forth. So these are different expressions of people who are looking at worship. So he continues, regarding the first work, it is to be considered as a work transmitting the virtues both in general and in detail by whatever means possible, so long as the virtues do not oppose the traditions or the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, contradict a fundamental rule, establish an innovation, set aside a principle, or disregard a legal judgment. The two writers mentioned, meaning the author of Qut al-Qulub and the Ahya, the two writers mentioned many subjects and hadiths whose basis are false, such as the prayer of desire, Salatul Raghaib. I think we talked about that last week. I could talk about it again in a second. And the supererogatory prayers specific to each day of the week, and prayers and invocations that have no authentic source whatsoever, such as the invocations made during the ablutions and the like. With regard to all the types mentioned above, they have been made to desire heaven, and have had the fear of God instilled in them by the likes of such books, and have shown self-evident signs resulting therefrom. Allahu A'lam. Okay, so the two great books that talk about this aspect of tasawwuf are Qut al-Qulub and the Ahya al-Din. Imam al-Ghazali based his Ahya, a lot of it is on the Qut al-Qulub, but because Imam al-Ghazali is Imam al-Ghazali, and he's like a superstar, his books ended up becoming the more famous of the two, but the Qut al-Qulub is a very good book, and some of the sections are taken directly from Qut al-Qulub in Ahya al-Din. So let's just focus on Ahya al-Din because that's the one that everyone knows and it's most accessible to English readers. One of the accusations that people levy against Imam Ghazali is that he has used weak hadith in certain sections. So this principle is kind of talking about, not directly, but you need to know that to understand why it's significant, because we use the weak hadith, especially in this kind of circumstance when we talk about pious works. I talked about in the last class, I believe, it's been some time since we did it, but I think we talked about Salatul Raghaib, which is a special type of prayer that some people do in the month of Rajab. And I talked about how in our tariq we don't do it because we're a little bit more nerdy. We're like, well, it's really, there's no hadith that's very sound about it. So I wouldn't criticize another tariq who does it. I mean, many of my friends in other turuq, they do the Salatul Raghaib. But it's not like a practice. If you find in our books and our manuals of awrad and devotional work, we don't really have Salatul Raghaib. Because, there's some question marks about that. However, his point at the end is, the book, the Ihya Ulumuddin, has guided generations, has guided millions of people. Millions of people have turned to Allah Ta'ala because of the writings of Imam al-Ghazali specifically and the Ihya Ulumuddin. So it's also a reminder for us that when it comes to pious works, we use the weak hadith. There are conditions for using the weak hadith. It can't be severely weak. It can't violate a principle of Islam. It can't contradict another text. But short of that, it can't violate, a principal belief of Islam. But short of that, we universally use weak hadith in fada'il al-a'mal, in good deeds and pious deeds. And that's why a lot of Sufi practices stem from those traditions. And that's why a lot of people in the modern world criticize tasawwuf because they think that tasawwuf is based on weak hadith, etc. Okay. Principle 71. The philosopher examines existence from the point of view of its inner realities, seeking the nature of its inner realities wheresoever this may lead him. So he rests his case on investigation. This is prejudicial to disciplehood, meaning being a murid. Not the best translation. Except in regards to a person of sound disposition, righteous state, and correct thinking. For the majority of believers, this way is impossible to follow. So, al-Faylasuf, right, the philosopher. If you're seeking and investigating, the way he said, you're not going to make the best murid, right? Because the murid is supposed to follow orders, follow the direction of the sheikh, submit to the awrad, submit to the guidance of the sheikh. So there is a philosophical tasawwuf. Like the best example of that is Shaykh al-Akbar, Ibn Arabi. But that is very rare for somebody to be able to find their path through that. Many, many beautiful insights. I mean, we call him Shaykh al-Akbar, the grand sheikh. But how many people can understand Shaykh al-Akbar? Sometimes people read that stuff and they just get more confused, right? And they just they're lost in this intellectual investigation. That's not conducive to suluk. That's what he's saying. It's not like a hard and fast rule for everybody, but usually for people like us, we don't sit here and meet every week and talk about the fine philosophical inquiries. We're trying to find a path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, he continues. The logician refers to the principle he follows when he seeks to investigate intelligible things. So logic is the rules of how you think. So you're looking at rational things and the rules about that. As a result, he veils the issue with excessive and exaggerated concepts. So Zarruq is attacking these subjects, of course. These are very important subjects, but he's attacking them from the lens of being a practitioner of tasawwuf, not from the lens of study, because he himself was a scholar of the outward sciences, and indeed that is our way. So the problem with the logician is that when you read the books of logic, especially the advanced books of logic, very really archaic terminology, and it might be like Latin or like these very Latin terms translated into Arabic. What's going on? What's all of this? It's very cerebral. It's almost like mathematics. Both the philosopher and the logician should be avoided because of the accessibility of their principles in general. The discourse of any of them should not be taken into consideration except to verify that what he has to say can be found in the works of others, thereby attributing to others what he has to say, rather than attributing to him what others have to say. Otherwise, one is in danger. We ask Allah Ta'ala for our well-being. So, you'll find a philosophical inquiry or a logical inquiry, and you will find in it something that sounds like, I think Imam al-Ghazali said something like this, or I found something like this similar in like a wird by Abu al-Hasan al-Shadhili or something like that. So he's like, if you reference it, then use that reference point as the basis, that this reference point has been mentioned by the philosophers, not the other way around. Because if you want to take the spiritual path seriously, you are not going to arrive by this overthinking philosophical inquiry, because tasawwuf is something to be experienced. Yes, there's the study of tasawwuf, which is what we do when we meet and we go over the book, and there are rules, and you have to know something about the Islamic sciences, of course. But the issue is, what are we trying to do with tasawwuf? Is we're trying to change ourselves, alter our state, increase our state, elevate our state. And that happens through practice, through dhikr. It doesn't happen through philosophical inquiry. So, when we talk about tasawwuf, we talk about three types of tasawwuf. There is the tasawwuf of the Salaf. This is like the tasawwuf of Imam al-Shafi'i, Imam Anas ibn Malik, Abi Hanifa, Al-Awza'i, these great luminary scholars that would read the Quran multiple times in the week, but they were very producing works to guide the ummah, etc. That's sort of like the early period of the tasawwuf. Then there is the Sunni tasawwuf. That's our type of tasawwuf, which is this is how later Sunnis, the Khalaf, the later generation, expressed the concept of ihsan that the Prophet ﷺ talked about in the hadith of Gabriel. And then there is philosophical tasawwuf, like that type of tasawwuf that's found, as I said, in Ibn Arabi, Ibn Sab'in, in some of the Shia works of Al-Hikmatul Aliyah, like Mullah Sadra and the Asfar and things like that. Philosophical tasawwuf are things that can be studied if you have the proper training, if you understand the right terminology. But what Zarruq is saying, from our perspective, you're not really going to, there's no wave for you to ride there to help you spiritually. It's really a cerebral thing. But for us, we are trying to do the work to bring about the actual change of the state and the heart. Okay, and we'll just do one more for today, which is principle 72. So he says, radiallahu anhu, for the cosmologist to consider, what is the original word? Yeah, somebody who studies nature. So for the cosmologist to consider whatever is in the soul as a principle and to subsume under the rubric of practical application whatever the elite do by way of strengthening themselves calls for deep perception, clear vision, and abundant knowledge. For some things are particular and others are general, and still others are extremely specific. So one must have a perfect sheikh in these things. Therefore it has been said, stay away from Al-Buni and his likes, stick to Khair al-Nassaj and his followers. This is only by way of pointing out the dangers of these things, but Allah Ta'ala knows best. I mean, two authors that have different sets of writing. So, again, another type of criticism, that if you are going to study cosmology, or a type of philosophical inquiry, and you are going to try to look at the issues of the soul, or the heart, or the nafs, which is the subject matter of tasawwuf, you have to be really clear, because there are specific things within the human creation that are spoken about in the Quran and the hadith traditions of the Prophet ﷺ that explain how we increase our closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how we suppress the lower nafs, increase the nafs, etc. So it's like using the wrong set of tools for the job. That's what he's saying. And this is a common problem, that people use the wrong set of skills or the wrong tools for the job that they're trying to solve. If I have like a plumbing problem, I mean, sorry to use such a pedestrian example, but if I have a plumbing problem, I need a plumber. I don't need a carpenter or, an electric worker or a builder or an architect, even though this might be the greatest architect ever and award-winning architecture, an architecture that inspires and on and on and on, but he's not a plumber, it's a plumbing problem. So tasawwuf requires tasawwuf, which is what we're talking about in these principles. If you're coming at it from another lens, if you're looking at from the cosmology lens or the philosophy lens or the logic lens or even the lens of fiqh, and you're trying to increase the nafs state, you're not going to be able to do it because it's the wrong set of terminology and the wrong equation, the wrong variables. You're only going to be able to excel at tasawwuf when you use the science of tasawwuf as established from the time of the Prophet ﷺ all the way to our time. So he's going to, I mean, the next several principles we'll talk about next week. Sort of, he goes on with the same thing, but it's very important as we start to define exactly what tasawwuf is and what are the tools that we use. والله تعالى أعلى وأعلم وصلى اللهم على سيدنا ومولانا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا.